Level design is what makes or breaks most games. In fact, it's the reason why my movement shooter driving game had to be put on hold. It's one thing to make a collection of mechanics, but assembling them together in an engaging game is just a completely different beast. In this video I'm going to show you the first 4 levels of my new game, where you use your previous attempts to build an army of drones, just to show you how I'm avoiding the common pitfalls that I see myself and a lot of other developers fall into. The most insanely, absolutely crucial concept you gotta understand as a game developer is that there's a disconnect between the knowledge that you have of your game and then the player's knowledge of the game. When I was talking to someone in my class about my new game, it took them about a week to fully understand the concept, and that was the help of a lot of diagrams and drawings. The thing is, while the description, a gamer use your previous attempts to build an army of drones, does briefly describe the game, it doesn't really provide enough detail about the second to second gameplay for the player to fully imagine in their brain what that would look like when they actually boot up the game. If I leave the level and go back in, do the drones still replay? How many drones do I get? How much can one drone do? Do the drones have health? Does my final time count the actual time playing, where I individually pilot each drone, or does it count the time for the replay to take place? I mean, I could actually go on for an hour coming up with assumptions that the player might make about the game, which doesn't actually line up with how the game actually is. That's why I spent the most time working on the first level. When you make your first level, you need to show like an insane amount of restraint. You know what the game feels like, you know how it smells, you know what I mean? To show you what I'm talking about, I'm going to go for the first level of Pizza Tower. Pizza Tower is very precise moves that do different jobs, so there is a quick tutorial on them beforehand, but even with that quick moveset overview, the player is going in essentially blind. The first room opens up with the player being required to jump, where they're met with 2 cheese slimes. Now these guys are interesting because they don't actually deal any sort of damage to the player, so the player essentially gets a free hit on them. Killing them is optional, but the player is required to smash through a wall in the middle of the room. Then they get to see a big floating topping on a platform, which gives them a bunch of points. They can't just simply jump up to get it, they need to perform a wall run into a jump to get there. After the topping, there's a second instance of a platform and a cheese slime, followed by a steel block. Steel blocks require the player to build up a bit of speed in order to destroy them. Alright, let's break down everything that just happened. The game completely requires the player to do the most basic actions, while giving them some optional challenges or some bonus points. The first jump only requires 1 button press, the breaking the wall, again, requires 1 button press, and finally, the steel block does require not only the run, but to have been running for a short while. It can get away with that extra bit of complexity for 3 reasons. Firstly, it was explained to the player that they needed to build up speed to destroy steel blocks in text during the tutorial. Secondly, it provides ideal conditions to perform the maneuver. And lastly, you're playing Pizza Tower, you're expecting to go fast. I know that last one seems a little bit cheeky, but you gotta realize, how a game's marketed or how it presents itself, it plays into how the player expects the game to play. That's the point of marketing. Just to go on a small tangent, Siege looks like every damn FPS under the sun, but all the trailers and ads, they all put the emphasis on teamwork and methodical gameplay. So even whenever I was booting up Siege for the first time, I didn't need the game to tell me in text or anywhere that I had to play it slower. I already knew that going in. That was everything that the player was required to do to get past the room. Now we're just going to briefly talk about the 2 things that they could do to get some extra points. The 2 optional mechanics can be completely ignored, but even then, if you do choose to go after them, you'll be learning fundamental skills which you'll need for later. The cheese slimes are really good punching bags, so the player can get a feel for how the enemies react to you in this game. And the wall jump and the bonus points will be some really valuable knowledge for the player to have, so being encouraged to perform that action early on is really important to ingrain it into the player's mind. That was only the first room of the first level of Pizza Tower. If you guys wanted to, I could analyze the rest of the level in a separate video, but before we get into the first level, we need to figure out how much information the player has before booting up the game. We're assuming that they've got through a Steam page or an itch.io page to download the game, so this means we can safely assume that they understand the basic premise, that there's going to be drones and some sort of replay system where previous attempts help you. Now the key thing is, they don't know the exact means in which this replay system works, so we need to keep that in mind. When they make it to the first level, they crash into the ground with some red text saying launch drone, and an arrow pointing to the corresponding button. The UI for the game is mostly white, so for any urgent details I use the colour red. As the drone spawns, more text appears telling the player the movement controls. Only when they get moving is there text that tells them how to shoot, and just to make it really obvious, it's pointing right at the door. In this first section, we need to describe some really ugly details. For all they know, that button could cause their game to crash and steal their bank details. In that order. Pizza Tower does this for the steel blocks, so I'd say we're on the right track. Only when the player has their drone do I tell them how to move. We've been talking about how the players go into this game blind, so literally everything is taking up space in their brain as they get used to the environment. For this reason, I only teach the player how to do things at the exact moment that it's relevant. So whenever the player is being taught how to shoot, they're actually hitting a target which they need to do in order to progress. The target itself was really difficult to get right. One of the major mechanics for the game was being able to shoot through certain walls, and there's two pieces of information that the player needs to be able to use that mechanic effectively. Firstly, they need to know what they can shoot, so the breakable objects like walls and floors have repetitive yellow stripes that have been integrated into the design. Has that technique been done to death? Is yellow paint everywhere? Yeah. Secondly, breakable objects have a clear visual indicator that they've been destroyed or not. Now that second one seems obvious, but the broken window used to just give off a brief particle effect, and because of the camera's perspective, you couldn't actually easily check if the window was actually broken. So to improve this, I added a pile of broken glass next to where the broken window is, which is much easier to see in a pinch. The more general concept I'm using here is that if the player needs to make a split-second decision, no matter how small, you should typically consider every piece of information that goes into that decision. Now, as much as I would love to say that I'm some sort of game dev messiah that just magically accounted for all these edge cases on my own, these design choices came about as a result of a horrific night where I got my mother, who has never touched a PC game in her life, to playtest my game. By observing how she played, which she couldn't at all, I realised that the biggest issue wasn't even mechanical skill, but rather a lack of the right information at the right time. The old tutorial I used had all the text appear at once, and it was the same colour as the rest of the UI. This caused two major problems. She didn't know what UI elements to prioritise, and in what order to perform each action, so this led to a situation where she was pressing WASD, expecting something to move, but she didn't know that you needed to launch a drone first. In her own words, I'm dead because everything looks dead. The drones are dead in the basket. And then this is my favourite. The mouse is off to find Jeffrey Epstein. Her words, not mine. This just goes to show the power of playtesting, because never in a trillion years will I find some of the issues that my mum found. Honestly, if you can get the most technologically illiterate person that you can find past the first 15 seconds of gameplay, you're on the right track. Just like in Pizza Tower, there's an optional path which gives the player more points in the form of a faster time if they learn to do a slightly more advanced maneuver where they fly and shoot at the same time, which is a really important skill to develop early on, just like the wall jump in Pizza Tower. I give the player a wee break in the form of an empty building so they can relax after that relatively information dense section. Pizza Tower provides the player with an inert enemy so the player can test out their murdering capabilities. In my level, I do the same, with the added twist of showing you that you can pierce walls. Enemies cannot kill you for breakable walls, but you can kill them, so this allows a free hit on this unsuspecting goon. At which point, the level splits into two sections. A bottom path where you need to accurately shoot two goons through a wall, and a top section that trains the player on how to effectively swing enemies. These are the two primary skills for combat in the game, so I want them to learn how to do this as early on as possible, while making sure this is not too difficult. Now there's been very little mention of the replay mechanic, and that's because I found a way to teach it to the player in a really cool way which shows them how it works and where it can be used. When the player gets to the section of the level that splits in two, if they decide to clear out the top or the bottom, they won't have enough ammo to deal with the other section. So this means that whenever they die, chances are they're going to try and spawn another drone, and I'm betting on the fact that the player from the itch or the Steam page knows that there's going to be a replay system somewhere, and that whenever they see the ghost of their previous attempt, they'll sort of connect the dots and understand how it works. To 100% drive this point home, you literally can't beat the level without the replay system, and that's because the one drone just doesn't have enough ammo. Whenever you're designing a level, you need to sort of get into the mind of your player. Alright, I need more than one drone because I've got limited ammo. Why does this need to be in the form of a replay system though? That's why the level splits in two at the end, so over the course of 2 attempts, 2 different actions can take place in 2 different locations that can be performed at the same time to get a faster run. If I simply just glued these 2 sections together, it would be less obvious why the replay system is so awesome. When you're introducing a more abstract concept to your game, you need to ensure that the player knows why the feature is useful, and it needs to be visually obvious what the mechanic is doing. Take the parry from Ultra Kill. If you've never seen the game, without any text or like tutorial, try and see if you can understand why it's a useful feature and describe the action being performed. Right, editor. What you're going to do here is you're going to give them a little like a little 10-second section to look at the clip. A big, unique looking projectile flies towards the player. The player punches the bullet and the screen flashes white to indicate a successful parry as the projectile is redirected towards the enemy. With just the gameplay alone, the usefulness and the functionality of your mechanics can be conveyed to the player in a way that words could never. Now of course, if the playtesters are getting confused or frustrated, don't be afraid to add text. To summarize, when you're making the first level for your game, you need to assume that the player only knows about 5% of the things that you show off in the trailers and the store pages. You also need to assume that the players learn how to use a mouse and a keyboard for the first time. If the player needs to be taught something, wait until they're able to perform that action before telling them about it. The text that you use to describe your mechanics should also stand out from the rest of the UI. Unless an element of uncertainty is crucial to your game, if the player is in a position to make a choice, they need to have all the necessary information to make that decision. And lastly, if you're going to introduce a new mechanic, ensure that the player is the best possible environment to perform that action, and that they need to repeat that action multiple times to progress. I think I can be a little bit lazy with that last one because the entire game is just repetition. Yo guys, I just had a playtest yesterday, that is not the case. I mean, you gotta like use text to describe some like wonky mechanics like at least 2 times and then have that be like the only way to progress. Because in the first level the player is able to like fly over the like destructible walls, be like the whole level without destroying any walls, and then get stuck at the last section where there was destructible walls. Like, you gotta make sure that whenever they're learning a new mechanic, they have to use that mechanic. And it's gotta be repeated at least guaranteed twice. If you can guarantee that the mechanic's gonna be repeated twice, you're chilling. Now, level 1 is really information dense. So for the second level, I decided to just keep things simple and just get the player used to how the drones move and shoot while showing off some of the replay mechanics. The level split into 2 sections, where if the player goes to the top first, they're going to be exposed to 2 sightlines at once. The trick is, if you go to the bottom path first, you can take those guys out safely, but you'll also have to deal with a cheeky guy at the end. The purpose of this level is to basically just show off the destructible walls, and to emphasize this, both paths start off with 2 wallbang kills. Where level 2 showed off the wallbangs, which is a much less abstract concept, in level 3, I really wanted to show off the power of the replay system. It's split into 2 multi-level buildings, where the player will have to apply both the lessons that they've learned in level 1 and 2. By having the drones take 2 completely separate paths, the player sees how they can use the system to beat levels of faster times. Before we get to level 4, it's probably a good time to talk about some of the artistic choices I made. I briefly touched on the fact that windows produce broken glass on the floor when they're destroyed. The reason I'm bringing this up again is because how you decide your game looks can drastically affect the gameplay. See, if I decided the game should take place from a first person perspective, I wouldn't have needed to make the broken glass more visible from a 2D perspective. In fact, it was this aspect of level design that killed my last game. I couldn't figure out a way to make a huge city that looks decent and doesn't tank performance. In fact, that's why this game takes place in a city. Not only does it suit the theme, but it also gives me a chance to figure out how to make a city that doesn't nuke my computer. There are 6 major design choices which I made, which work towards suiting the theme of the game, optimizing the game, and speeding up production. Firstly, the level is being sliced in half. This makes the ability for the player to see inside the buildings much less jarring, and it also means that I don't have to spend time working on making the foreground look good. Secondly, the buildings are very simple shapes without details. This keeps the amount of triangles per building very low, while ensuring that it's just enough detail for a plausible city. Thirdly, all the buildings in the back are just billboards, which gives the illusion of a vast city, without the heaps of time and processing power which actually comes with creating one. Fourthly, I used the age-old technique of using fog to limit how far the player can see, which creates this grimy city feeling, while reducing the amount of stuff that I need to put in the background. Fifthly, the camera's FOV is only 30. This makes it look like you're spying on the enemies. It reduces the width of the city, and it solves a problem where the 2D cursor doesn't line up with the 3D perspective. To explain this, in a traditional 2D game, you can imagine the camera as being orthographic, where every pixel is travelling parallel towards the camera. This means where something appears to be is exactly where it actually is. With a perspective camera in a 3D game, if you use the example from before of each pixel travelling towards the camera, instead of the pixels travelling parallel, they converge onto a single point. This means that if you try to interact with a perspective image, with a 2D cursor that assumes the image is orthographic, you have a slight offset, which in a game that relies on accuracy can be extremely problematic. By moving the camera back and lowering the FOV, the path that the pixels take appears to become more and more parallel, and the cursor's apparent position in the world becomes more accurate, which removes the problem while keeping the perspective look. Lastly, I use a film grain effect to make it more apparent that you're spying on the enemies. It also gives the buildings a texture which I would otherwise have to make on my own. To cap this section off, I'm going to quickly talk about how the post-game replay feature helps players learn. By watching back their runs, they can see the replay system in action and figure out ways to get a better time. Right, let's get back to level 4. The first 3 levels were very open, offering cheeky little paths that you could take to gain the advantage, while still teaching you about some of the core mechanics and techniques. Level 4 is like the first boss fight. The level's a lot less open, and it requires some replay based puzzle solving to beat. It opens up with text explicitly stating that the player can only shoot for one target at a time, and then there's 2 vertical shots that the player must take, which are lined up in such a way that if the player had infinite piercing power, they could kill both goons. So this just immediately establishes the piercing limit. Now there's been instances where the piercing limits affected gameplay in the past few levels, but having the text here and the immediate demonstration afterwards just gets rid of any uncertainty that the player might have. Because this is almost like a puzzle game, so having all the information you need to solve the puzzle is really important. The first sightline that the player is exposed to upon entering the building is a long range shot that they gotta take, which leads to an enemy being killed, but because of the pierce limit, they need to fire quickly again to kill the second enemy behind the first enemy. This almost serves as a micro tutorial for the rest of the level, as the main objective is to get a drone for the middle section, which is being guarded by a bunch of goons. Now the player could try and fly through the middle and precisely time each shot, or they could use a drone to take out each floor 2 bullets at a time, safely behind the breakable walls, just like on the ground floor. All that just for the first drone to fly through the middle and beat the level. When you're making these harder levels, you need to ensure that the player has all the knowledge that they need to deal with the increased difficulty. Right, truthfully, right, you could watch a million of these videos, but you wouldn't learn as much as you would from setting up a single playtest. In fact, I think playtesting is so important that I made a whole video about the challenges that comes with designing levels, just as an excuse to advertise my own playtest. Link in description. Fill out the Google form and apply to the Discord. Joking aside, as early as getting the first level made, you should set up an itch.io account and then get a Discord for playtesters. It took me 5 hours to do both in one day, and it costs you literally nothing. If you can, ask for a video from the playtesters so you can sort of see their gameplay and see where they get stuck. Set up a Google form. I've got my first one on the screen right now just to give you some ideas for what questions to ask. And yeah, hopefully you learned something useful in this video. Go on and make cool stuff. Thanks for watching. Bye. Playtest my game. The more general concept that I'm using here is Yo guys, there's people that go to the coal mines to get black cancerous lungs. My job might be harder than them, because I gotta deal with bullshit like this, bro.